Have you ever witnessed a verdict so shocking it redefines justice? Are you ready to uncover the truth behind one judge's unexpected decision? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Inside the hallowed chamber of the courthouse, where the weight of countless lives and unresolved grievances lingered like silent witnesses, Judge Michael Turner sat poised at his bench. The trial before him was not merely another case. It was a collision of fate, memories, and the eternal struggle between strict legalism and compassionate mercy. Michael's mind raced as he prepared to navigate the labyrinth of evidence, testimonies, and conflicting emotions that had gradually unfurled over the course of this unprecedented case. His thoughts drifted back to his earliest days in a small town, where injustice was an all-too-familiar visitor and every hardship etched deep marks upon the soul. Growing up in a modest household, he had witnessed firsthand the crippling effects of inequality. His father's worn-out hands, etched with the strains of labor and constant worry, and his mother's quiet endurance in the face of life's relentless challenges. These early experiences had seeded within him an unwavering commitment to fairness, a desire to ensure that every individual, regardless of circumstance, received the dignity they deserved. Now, as he observed the unfolding drama in the courtroom, those childhood memories resonated with an almost tangible intensity. The defendant, a man whose past was riddled with misfortune and questionable decisions, stood accused of a crime that defied simple explanation. As the evidence piled up, each document, each whispered testimony, a tapestry of sorrow and struggle began to emerge, interweaving the defendant's life with threads of neglect, desperation, and moments of fleeting hope. Michael could not help but see fragments of his own past in the narrative laid before him. Every piece of evidence, every subtle nuance in the witness accounts, compelled him to question whether the punitive measures traditionally associated with the law might sometimes obscure the greater need for understanding and rehabilitation. In those silent, pensive moments between the lawyer's impassioned speeches and the murmurs of the gathered crowd, the judge's internal dialogue grew louder. He recalled a time, long ago, when his own future had hung in the balance. A time when a seemingly insurmountable injustice had forced him to choose between bitterness and the pursuit of transformative change. That memory, though painful, had ignited within him a resolve to seek not just retribution, but redemption for those who had fallen through the cracks of a rigid legal system. As the trial advanced, the courtroom transformed into a microcosm of human experience. The air was thick with tension as each witness took the stand, their voices trembling with fear, regret, and sometimes even a glimmer of hope. One witness, his hands shaking and his eyes filled with sorrow, recounted an incident on a stormy night, a night when fate dealt its cruel hand and changed lives forever. His words, laced with a palpable mix of despair and determination, evoked images of cold rain, darkened alleys, and the haunting silence of lost opportunities. With every detail, Michael felt the weight of the moment intensify. He listened intently, not just with the analytical mind of a jurist, but with the empathetic heart of a man who had known loss and the bitter sting of injustice. The case was beginning to reveal its many layers, each one more complex than the last. There were whispers that the defendant, despite the glaring evidence against him, had once been a promising individual, one who, under different circumstances, might have had a chance at a better life. These murmurs of a hidden past, where dreams had been dashed by circumstances beyond control, resonated deeply with Michael's own memories of youthful hope crushed by the harsh realities of life. Every now and then, he would catch himself lost in thought, recalling moments from his early days on the bench when he had vowed to be a beacon of fairness, to temper the unyielding rigidity of the law with the warmth of human compassion. The courtroom, with its austere decor and solemn atmosphere, suddenly seemed less like an arena for punishment and more like a sanctuary for lost souls seeking validation and a second chance. The judge's internal struggle grew more pronounced with each passing testimony. His mind was a battleground where legal principles clashed with the emotional truths of the case. He remembered a particular incident from his past, a day when a close friend, accused of a misdeed he did not commit, had been condemned not only by the legal system but by society at large. The injustice of that moment had haunted him for years, serving as a constant reminder that the law, when applied without empathy, could be as cold and unyielding as the winter winds that battered his childhood town. In that moment, as he listened to yet another account of misfortune and regret, Michael could almost feel the presence of all those who had suffered quietly in the shadows of society. The voices of the oppressed, the unheard, and the forgotten seemed to rise in unison, urging him to consider a verdict that would transcend the ordinary bounds of legal retribution. The courtroom's atmosphere was charged with anticipation, every onlooker keenly aware that they were witnessing more than just a trial. They were witnessing the evolution of justice itself. The delicate balance between the letter of the law and the spirit of compassion hung in the air like a fragile thread, one that threatened to snap under the weight of accumulated sorrow and the promise of renewal. Michael's gaze often wandered to the faces of those present, the tear-streaked eyes of family members who had lost everything, the hardened expressions of individuals who had borne the brunt of systemic neglect, and even the subtle nods of approval from those who believed that every life deserved a chance to change. Each look, each silent plea, added another layer of complexity to the decision he was forced to make. The trial was no longer a mere legal proceeding. It had become a mirror reflecting the collective pain and hope of a community long starved for justice. In the midst of this emotional maelstrom, Michael's sense of duty began to merge with his personal history. He realized that every legal statute he had ever upheld was now being put to the ultimate test. It was not enough to simply deliver a verdict that conformed to precedent. He had to offer a resolution that acknowledged the myriad shades of human frailty and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest of circumstances. The evidence before him was as multifaceted as the human condition itself. Some testimonies painted the defendant as a product of an unforgiving environment, a man who had been shaped by a series of unfortunate events, each compounding the other into an inescapable spiral of despair. Other accounts, however, hinted at moments of unexpected kindness, fleeting instances where the defendant had shown a capacity for change that defied the odds. It was in these moments of contradiction that Michael found himself most conflicted. His heart, burdened by memories of personal loss and societal failure, urged him to consider a path that allowed for both accountability and the possibility of renewal. There was a growing realization that true justice might sometimes require stepping beyond the rigid confines of the law to embrace a more humane approach, one that recognized that every transgression, no matter how grievous, could be met with an opportunity for transformation. As the trial neared its climax, the cumulative weight of these reflections pressed down upon him like an unbearable force. Michael's mind was a whirlwind of emotions and memories, a tumultuous blend of duty, empathy, and a fervent desire to right the wrongs that had long festered in the shadows of society. The courtroom, silent save for the rustle of papers and the occasional murmur of an onlooker, became the stage for a final reckoning between the cold, hard principles of law and the fluid, often unpredictable nature of the human heart. In that charged atmosphere, every whispered word and every measured pause carried the promise of change. Michael Turner, the man behind the bench, was about to deliver a verdict that would not only determine the fate of the defendant, but also set a precedent for the kind of justice that could heal rather than simply punish. It was a moment that encapsulated everything he had ever believed in, a moment where the echoes of his past converged with the hopes of a community yearning for compassion and understanding. As he prepared to speak, the judge's inner voice grew louder, urging him to let go of the strictures of tradition in favor of a decision that recognized the inherent worth of every human being. The silent tension in the room was palpable as Michael drew a deep breath, steadying himself for the words that would soon change the course of lives. His mind was filled with the faces of those who had come seeking justice, their eyes reflecting a profound need for both accountability and mercy. In that silent communion, the courtroom became more than just a place of judgment. It became a testament to the enduring power of empathy in the face of adversity. Every memory, every whispered hope, and every pang of sorrow coalesced into a singular moment of clarity. It was then that Michael Turner realized that his decision must be a beacon of hope, a guiding light that would illuminate the possibility of redemption, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. With the gravity of his past and the weight of countless lives behind him, he knew that the verdict he was about to deliver would echo far beyond the confines of the courtroom. It would resonate as a declaration that true justice, tempered with compassion, was the only way to mend the fractures of a society long marred by indifference and pain. In that moment, as the final strands of doubt fell away, Michael prepared to set aside the rigid interpretations of the law in favor of a decision that would honor both the letter and the spirit of justice. The courtroom held its breath, every soul present waiting for the culmination of a trial that had grown into something far greater than any one man's story. It was a moment of reckoning, a point at which the past, present, and future converged in a single, decisive act of mercy and resolve. And so, with a calm that belied the turbulent emotions within, Judge Michael Turner leaned forward, his eyes meeting those of every person in the room, ready to offer not just a ruling, but a legacy built on the belief that even in a world defined by strict rules and unyielding judgment, there remained a place for compassion, forgiveness, and the hope of redemption. The courtroom, silent as a graveyard, held its breath in anticipation. Every eye was fixed on Judge Michael Turner, whose fingers rested motionlessly on the thick case file before him. The weight of the decision bore down on him like an invisible chain, and for the first time in years, he felt the true burden of justice, not as a set of laws written in ink, but as the unspoken responsibility of shaping a man's fate. His mind swirled with the echoes of every testimony, every argument, every pleading expression that had graced his courtroom over the past weeks. The defendant, a man whose very existence seemed to teeter on the fragile boundary between victim and perpetrator, stood with his hands clasped tightly together. His face, weathered by a lifetime of struggles, was marked with an expression of quiet resignation, as if he had already accepted whatever punishment was coming. Yet in his eyes, there was something more, something Judge Turner could not ignore. Michael's gaze flickered to the prosecutor, who stood firm, unwavering, his confidence unshaken. To him, this case was simple. The law had been broken. Evidence had been presented. The punishment should be swift and absolute. The defense attorney, in contrast, sat stiffly, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. He had fought hard, argued passionately, and exposed the human element beneath the surface of the crime, but he knew the truth. Judges rarely strayed from the expected course. The weight of silence pressed harder. The spectators, families, reporters, curious onlookers, sat like statues, their breath collectively suspended. Even the stenographer, whose fingers usually danced rhythmically over the keyboard, had stilled, waiting. The air itself seemed heavy, charged with something unspoken, something no one dared to voice but everyone could feel. It was the weight of a moment where fate was no longer abstract but real, tangible, shaped by the simple utterance of a single man. Judge Turner closed his eyes for a moment, allowing his thoughts to settle. He had spent his life believing in the purity of justice, in the necessity of laws that guided a broken society toward order. But today, as he looked upon the accused, he felt something he had spent years suppressing: doubt. Not doubt in the facts of the case, but doubt in the rigidness of the system he had sworn to uphold. The man before him was guilty. There was no question about that. He had broken the law, and the law demanded punishment. But was that all? Was that the only path forward? His father's voice drifted into his mind, a distant memory from childhood. Justice, Michael, is not just about what is right. It is about what is fair. His father had been a simple man, working long hours, earning barely enough to put food on the table. He had never studied law, never stood in a courtroom, but he had known suffering and he had known kindness. Michael exhaled, lifting his eyes once more to the man before him. He thought of the circumstances, of the choices this man had made. Not out of greed, not out of malice, but out of desperation. He thought of the broken system that had led him here, the society that had failed him long before he ever set foot in this courtroom. And for the first time in his career, he felt the overwhelming, undeniable truth. Justice was not always black and white. He straightened, his hands pressing against the smooth surface of his desk. The room tensed, as if everyone knew this moment would be different, that something unprecedented was about to unfold. He spoke, and as the first words left his lips, an electric current rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution's confidence faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. The defense attorney, frozen in his seat, inhaled sharply as if not daring to believe what he was hearing. The defendant, standing before the judge with a lifetime of burdens etched into his skin, did not move, but his eyes burned with something new. Hope. Judge Turner's voice was steady, measured, yet infused with something rare. Conviction not only in the law, but in his own sense of morality. He laid out his reasoning, not just citing legal precedent, but weaving a narrative of human nature, of the gray areas that laws often fail to acknowledge. He spoke of a justice system that must evolve, that must recognize when punishment alone was not the answer. He spoke not as a judge bound by statutes, but as a man who had seen the way society could fail those who needed help the most. His words, though carefully chosen, carried the weight of something greater than law, compassion. And in that moment, the balance of power in the room shifted. This was no longer a simple trial, no longer a case to be filed away in some archive. This was a statement, a stand, a declaration that justice was not only about retribution, but about redemption. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. The prosecutor's mouth tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. The defense attorney's shoulders sagged, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. But the most striking reaction came from the defendant himself. For the first time since the trial had begun, his eyes brimmed with tears. Not tears of relief, not tears of victory, but tears of something deeper, recognition. Someone had seen him. Someone had looked beyond the ink on the pages of his case file and seen the human being beneath. And in that moment, something within him shifted. Judge Turner continued, his decision unfolding like a story in itself. There would be consequences, yes, for no crime could go without accountability. But there would also be opportunity, a chance, a pathway not to ruin, but to redemption. And that he knew was the true essence of justice. By the time he finished speaking, the courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become something else, a symbol of what justice could be when wielded with wisdom rather than blind adherence to rules. The moment lingered, stretching on, as if time itself had paused to bear witness. Then, slowly, the world resumed its pace. The gavel fell, a sound that marked not just the end of the trial, but the beginning of something greater. The defendant, his hands still shaking, mouthed something silently, "Thank you." The defense attorney exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. The prosecutor, though clearly displeased, nodded stiffly, recognizing that he had just witnessed something he could not easily argue against. As the crowd dispersed, murmurs filled the air. Some called it revolutionary, others called it reckless. But one thing was certain, no one would forget what had happened in that courtroom today. And as Judge Michael Turner gathered his papers, preparing to leave the bench, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Peace. For the first time in years, he did not just feel like a judge. He felt like a man who had done what was truly right, and that he knew was the greatest verdict of all. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension just moments ago, now felt strangely weightless, as if the verdict had lifted an invisible burden from the very air. People whispered among themselves, their hushed voices a mix of shock, admiration, and curiosity. The sound of chairs scraping against the polished wooden floor echoed softly as the audience rose to leave. But no one rushed for the door. It was as if they all knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that would be remembered long after they left this room. Judge Michael Turner remained seated on the bench, his fingers resting lightly on the gavel. He watched as the defendant, a man who had walked into this courtroom with the weight of the world on his shoulders, stood frozen for a moment. The verdict had been read. The decision had been made, but the man still seemed to be processing it. His hands, rough and calloused from years of hardship, trembled slightly. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. Then, slowly, he looked up, his eyes meeting the judge's. And in that gaze, there was something Judge Turner recognized, a flicker of gratitude, of understanding. A silent conversation passed between them, one that needed no words. It was the unspoken acknowledgement that this moment was not just about guilt or innocence. It was about something much deeper. It was about justice that saw beyond the crime, that acknowledged the humanity of those who stood before it. The bailiff gently placed a hand on the defendant's arm, signaling that it was time to go. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned to leave. But just before he took his first step, he did something no one expected. He bowed his head, not in defeat, but in respect. And then he walked out of the courtroom, not as a broken man, but as someone given a second chance. Judge Turner leaned back in his chair, his mind still lingering on the events that had just unfolded. He had presided over hundreds of cases in his career, each one leaving a different mark on him. But this one felt different. This was not just another verdict. This was a moment where the law and human conscience had intersected, where justice had been tempered with wisdom rather than blind adherence to rules. A sharp voice interrupted his thoughts. Judge Turner came the clipped tone of the prosecutor, who had remained behind. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a slight furrow in his brow. "May I have a word?" Judge Turner nodded, motioning for him to speak. "With all due respect, sir," the prosecutor began, his voice measured, "I do not question your authority, nor your experience. But today was unprecedented. You did not just deliver a verdict. You reshaped the very way justice was handed down in this courtroom. Are you prepared for what that means?" Michael studied the younger man before him. He saw the ambition in his eyes, the belief in the law as something absolute and unyielding. It was the same belief he had once held, long ago, before he understood that the law was not just a collection of rules, but a reflection of the people it governed. "I understand your concern," Judge Turner said, his voice calm yet firm. "But tell me, do you believe justice was served today?" The prosecutor hesitated. It was clear he wanted to argue, to challenge, but something held him back. He glanced toward the empty defense table, toward the door where the defendant had left, and for the briefest moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. I suppose that depends on how one defines justice," he finally admitted. Judge Turner allowed a small smile to touch his lips. "And that," he said, "is exactly the question we should always be asking." The prosecutor exhaled, as if realizing this was not a debate he would win today. With a respectful nod, he turned and walked away, leaving the judge alone once more. As the last of the spectators trickled out of the courtroom, Judge Turner took a slow breath. He glanced at the now empty chair where the defendant had sat, at the stand where testimonies had been given, at the very walls of the room that had witnessed so many lives changed by the decisions made within them. For years, he had believed that justice was about punishment, about maintaining order through unwavering adherence to the law. But today, he had realized something far more profound. Justice was not about following rules blindly. It was about understanding them, about knowing when they needed to be applied and when they needed to be questioned. He stood up, gathering his notes, but before he could leave, he noticed someone lingering at the back of the courtroom. A young woman, no older than her early 20s, stood near the doors. She was clutching a notebook to her chest, her expression a mix of admiration and determination. "Sir," she said hesitantly, stepping forward, I just wanted to say that what you did today, it meant something. I am studying law, and I have always believed that a judge should be strict, that the law should be followed no matter what. But today, I saw something different. You did not just enforce the law. You used it to make a difference." Michael regarded her thoughtfully. He saw in her the same youthful certainty he had once possessed, the same desire to make an impact. "The law is a tool," he said gently. "It can be used to build or to destroy. The real challenge is knowing how to wield it." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of his words. Then, with a grateful smile, she turned and walked away, leaving Judge Turner alone in the vast, now empty courtroom. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening to the silence. Then, with a quiet exhale, he stepped down from the bench and walked toward the exit, feeling something he had not felt in a very long time: purpose. As he pushed open the doors and stepped into the hallway, the world outside seemed a little brighter, a little more hopeful. He had spent years believing that justice was rigid, unchanging. But today, he had learned that true justice was not about laws. It was about people. And for the first time in his career, he knew he was not just a judge. He was a servant of justice in the truest sense of the word. And that, he realized, was the greatest verdict of all.